Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of Career Showcase. My name is Sanjana, and I'll be the moderator for this event. Before we get started, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial and encourage all of you to acknowledge the land you're on as well and reflect on how you can further support reconciliation efforts. Today's event is part of the Career Showcase series that is hosted by the Federal Youth Network, where various types of career in the Government of Canada are explored, including policy, science, HR, communications, and more. Today's segment will focus on all things policy, particularly policy pathway from ideas to influence. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda for today. So after welcoming remarks, we'll see some so after welcoming remarks, and we'll hear from our lovely panelists today. So I'm excited to present our three panelists who will be diving deep into their policy career journey and sharing their unique experiences. First, we will have Paul Gaskin, who is the Director General for Planning, Operation, and Information for Canadian Forest Service within Natural Resource Canada. Next, we have Emma Crudis, who is a policy analyst in the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch at Indigenous Service Canada. Then we have Christopher Fernandez, who is a senior policy analyst at the Privy Council Office, covering Canada and U.S. relations at the Foreign and Defense Policy Secretariat. These professionals will be going more into depth regarding their specific experiences later on in this event. So next we'll be going on to the instructions for the event today. And I know you probably heard this a million times, but to ensure that this event is high quality and enjoyable by all participants, make sure that your cameras are deactivated and that your microphones are muted. The panel discussion will only be in English today. However, the French policy panel will be held today at 2:30 Eastern if that is something that interests you. As we move through today's session, please share your comments in the chat space and questions by using the Q&A button in the language of your choice. And make sure to vote for your favorite questions by clicking on the thumbs up button, and I'll be reading the most popular votes to our panelists to answer. So with that said, before we start the event, we want to learn all about you through an optional poll to kick us off. So we want to know, what field do you currently work in? If you could switch to any job within the government for a day, what would it be? And what motivates you most in your career? Ooh, I see a lot of people answering. So far, policies in the win for career. Ooh, a lot of international interests. Hmm. Seems like the answers are slowing down a bit by now. Cool. So it seems like most people are from the policy division with the least amount in learning and development. Or actually, most of you are from other. Maybe if you want to comment in the chat what other means if you wanted to. If you can choose switch to any jobs, a lot of you said international affairs advisor or international analyst. And then you're most motivated by learning and growth opportunities. Wow, very interesting. I hope you all enjoy what the panelists have to say today. So now that we learned all about you, so now that we learned all about you, I will just quickly share some facts about myself. So, um, so in my substantive position, I work as an analyst for the Office of Public Service Accessibility at Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat for the Policy Engagement Team, where I've been working for close to 4 years now. Prior to that, I completed my undergraduate degree in the Joint Honors Program of Sociology and Anthropology and a master's with a focus on legal anthropology from the University of Ottawa. During my time there, I was very involved with the student community and held various leadership positions in the Sociology and Anthropology Student Association and completed my final year as president. In this capacity, I was involved in fostering social and academic events for students to support connections between the students, the faculty, and the social science department. I clearly couldn't let go of the side hustle because today I currently support the young or young at heart professional community by serving as the co-chair for the Departmental Young Professional Network at TPS and as event coordinator for the National Capital Region YPN. So the key takeaways and learning objectives of this event, if you could go to the next slide, please, would be to help you identify if the career path of policy sparks your interest. By the end of today's session, you will learn about the typical responsibility of policy professional by learning from their experience and day-to-day realities, understand key competencies required for pursuing a career in policy, and learn about how the panelists were able to acquire the required skills, and then navigate networking and mentoring opportunities to learn more about a career in policy. There will be a significant amount of time at the end just for you to ask all your burning questions to our skilled and knowledgeable panelists here today. And with that said, I will pass the mic over to Christopher, who will be going over the requirements for a career in policy.
Awesome. Thank you, Sanjana. Again, my name's Chris, and I guess we'll do a bit of an introduction a bit later about what we do and where I work. But I'm more than happy to start talking a bit about exploring career paths in the government of Canada, and in particular, policy. Generally, policy positions are staffed in the EC classification. So you might hear a few letters thrown around. EC stand for Economics and Social Science Services, and it's an occupational group that most policy people fit into, but it's certainly not the only one. In terms of a qualification standard, generally it requires either a graduation with a degree from a recognized post-secondary institution with an acceptable specialization in economics, sociology, or statistics. And what that kind of means in general terms is you need to have a certain amount of courses in that area. If you're currently a student in an undergraduate school and you are taking some courses, it's always a great idea to have some of these built into your degree if you have electives. And if some of you are in your master's or you're doing some postgraduate studies, most public policy programs or public admin programs have these courses built in. But again, it's certainly not the only pathway. However, a degree is always required, but could be attained through an acceptable combination of education, training, and or experience. So it's kind of a variable field there. But within policy, there are many different types of policy, and you're going to be meeting a couple of people today on the screen or in your work who are in various stages of policy. So they include strategic policy development. So, for example, we were making a policy, maybe you're trying to evaluate that policy or what it's actually doing. Sometimes you're trying to think about how does it actually pass through Parliament. So, a legislative affairs policy analyst, or maybe the government needs to regulate that policy. So, a regulatory affairs analyst. So, in all of these cases, policy is very, very widespread. And as I said, you'll be meeting a few of us today, but it's certainly not just located to policy analysts, sorry. And so, where are the jobs in the policy in the government of Canada? They're everywhere. Most departments have some form of policy included in them. And so, it really depends on your personal preferences or your skills, but it shouldn't certainly preclude you from any position. So, again, you'll be meeting a few of us today who've had some variable experiences in our respective policy fields. And I encourage, when we do answer some questions, to ask us anything that may be of relevance to your interest in policy. So with that, I'll pass it back to Sanjana or to the next slide and to my next panelist.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. Next up is Emma, who will be describing more specifically on the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Sanjana, and hello all. Great transition, Chris. I'm going to speak a little bit to what we do on the day-to-day. We are, as Chris alluded to, we serve in a variety of capacities, but really policy professionals are foundational to the responsibility of public servants to contribute to properly informed democratic institutions. And at the core, our job is about evidence-based advice to decision-making authorities. So those would be elected officials, ministers, etc. No matter what level of authority you hold in a policy role, you are contributing to this decision-making process, and your skills in analytical and critical thinking are vital to that work. Some of the common responsibilities you might come up with if you're working in policy would be reviewing, analyzing, developing, and updating policies, specializing in specific policy areas such as education, defense, immigration, treaty rights, or energy, analyzing and interpreting public policies and their impact, developing recommendations to improve existing policies or create new ones, identifying problems, analyzing data, and making recommendations to decision makers. And I think it's important to recognize the distinctions between roles and regions and headquarters as well, because where policy roles might influence development or implementation of policies will look very different in those contexts. So happy to explore that more if folks have questions. Outside of upper management roles, you'll see titles typically including analysts, officers, researchers, or advisors. To Chris's point, the analysis or analyst name is often thrown around, but there are lots of different roles within policy. And it's really about striking a balance between, deeply educated, informed, and creative thinking and very practical guidance and advice on policy development and implementation. I will just briefly point back to that subtitle, which I think is really important, which is Fearless Advice and Loyal Implementation. That's so much of what we do. We're committed to that loyal implementation, whether decide upon approaches follow our advice or not. And depending on what level of advice you're providing as well, that's going to look different. But it's a key part of who we are and what we do in policy. Thanks so much. Pass it back to you, Sanjana.
Thank you so much for going into depth of what professionals do, Emma. Next, I'm passing it off to Paul, who will explore key competencies.
Thanks. And building on what Chris and Emma said already, this is a really good list of what you need to do, what the expectations are for a policy analyst or policy person. And as they both hinted at, of course, there's a wide range. There's a wide range of working on operational policy. I've worked in many different jobs, different departments, starting out in international policy, working in operational, affecting actual stakeholders in fisheries or in transport. And that can be the broader, the sort of big policy that Chris hinted at when you're actually creating cabinet briefing notes or memorandums of cabinet, which are the policy decision-making apparatus that have cabinet and prime minister decide on things. And then also Treasury board submissions where actually decide what a program would look like. So these are very important skills. I point people, if you just Google Treasury board key leadership competencies, those are lists from like DG level, director level, down to manager level, and that's what you should be aiming for. Those are the kind of long descriptions of what people want to be measured on, look for, and in terms of competitions, evaluation, all those things. Those are the things we're looking for. This list you see here is relatively straightforward, but all important. I would say what I see is there's a ton of horizontal collaboration. It's essential for anything. As a DG, I don't decide anything. I work with 8 DGs across the Forest Service, 25 DGs across NRCan, and hundreds of DGs across the country in different departments. So the actual decision point of any one person is pretty low, even for deputy ministers. So the collaboration is essential, as is stakeholder outreach and relationship management. So if you're an introvert, work on being an extrovert. If you're, action oriented, work on your thinking skills and your sort of patience. If you're a researcher, work on your action skills. So making sure you're as comprehensive and as broad built as possible. So you got a wide range so you can sort of deliver what your bosses will be looking for. Now, after that, I'm going to turn it back to Sanjana.
Thanks for that, Paul. Now that you all have heard how knowledgeable and interesting the panelists are, next you'll be able to hear about their specific, unique experiences of their journey towards policy. So now that you have the structure view, now you'll learn about the more specialized and unique views, and maybe it might apply to you too. So I'll pass it back to you, Paul, as the first presenter. Oh, sorry.
There you go. Thank you. Sorry. I'm not going to go into my bio. It's all there, and feel free to look me up on LinkedIn if you want even more detail. But I will say I've sort of, as I hinted at, worked in many different departments. I started essentially in the international policy area, working at fisheries and then transport, working Privy Council office and cabinet, global affairs for a couple of years, and then fisheries for a long time, where my first sort of key sort of manager role was as chief of policy renewal. And that was actually working on documentation, advice to the minister on land and fisheries policy renewal. So it was actually affecting Canadians, how they fish, what they can fish, all the rules and policies surrounding that. So that's a kind of comprehensive multi-year policy experience. Then beyond that, I worked in different areas on oceans policy, and on director of horizontal policy after that. Different areas where the focus is different, but sort of the apparatus and structures are similar. Ultimately, as a policy analyst, you need to be able to write really, really well. You need to be able to write for your audience, meaning that sometimes it's a 20-page research paper, sometimes it's a 2-page briefing note, sometimes it's a question on the order paper, meaning parliamentarian has asked a question and they have 30 seconds and you have to write that response for the minister. So there's a wide range, but it all comes down to be able to analyze, research, write well succinctly for the audience, targeting. From my own experience, I would say moving around, I'm a bit of a generalist, to different areas is normal, but not necessarily essential. There are specialists who stick in one area. I was in the trade part of global affairs for several years, and there are specialists who work in like phytosanitary or services or all the sort of expertise. And so there is, if you find your niche and you love that niche, by all means, that's a good place to work. If you are looking at sort of different options, say management or something like that, a lot of executives come from the policy field, and that's because of that skill set you see. You see people needing to think, needing to collaborate and do all these sort of things and sort of think broadly and widely. Doesn't mean you need to, but it is an option. I would say that as far as beyond that, moved into other areas, and collaboration is key. Once you think you know something, usually the field is moving. Certainly for students and newer people, you hear AI, you have to say it all the time. It's now mandatory that I say AI any meeting I'm in, but it does demonstrate the sort of the evolution, the speed with which your research and your knowledge changes, staying up to speed, staying aware of whatever field you might be in, and also on the whole public administration field, figuring out how things operate. We had an election a little while ago, and from that you see a new government, same party, very different priorities, and the executive and management, everyone has to shift a bit to suit those priorities. I think it was Chris that said earlier, or Emma's slide, we always have to loyally implement decisions lawfully taken. That means the minister's the decider. As bureaucrats, we implement decisions taken. That sometimes means providing a lot of advice, research, and options for the minister to actually achieve what they want to achieve. Right. I'll stop there. I think I've said enough. But essentially, the great thing about policy is it is a many tentacle beast, and you can move in many, many different directions.
Thanks for sharing, Paul. I really like the adaptable notion of policy, and even with the topic of ocean policy, I'm sure many questions will come up on that. So next is Emma Kudis, who will be presenting her.
Great, thanks, Sanjana. Nice to hear your background as well, Paul, beyond the bio. Nice to hear. I'm joining today's call from Kjipuktuk Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq people. I joined the federal government in November of 2021, and I started as an analyst in March of last year. So I'm absolutely the rookie on this panel, which may be helpful in understanding sort of early career information about policy. So I work for Indigenous Services Canada, as Sanjana alluded to earlier, in the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. And our department's vision is really to support and empower Indigenous peoples to independently deliver services and address the socioeconomic conditions in their communities. I work in the Atlantic region, so I don't work in headquarters, I work in a region. And for those who don't know, the Atlantic is one of the only regions in the country that serves multiple provinces. So we serve First Nations and Inuit people in all 4 Atlantic provinces, multiple health authorities, and that means 34 First Nations health centers. So in my particular role, I support a co-management table between First Nations and the department with a specific focus on public health, on anti-Indigenous racism, on chronic disease, and on food security. And this co-management table, which is known as the Health Partnership, is a unique policy framework in the country that engages First Nations to develop input to influence policy change at the national level. It shares in decision making on regional operational policies, and it actually encourages partnerships with provincial and other federal departments for action on health systems, interdependencies, and intergovernmental action on the determinants of health. So one of the things I'll say I truly love about my job is that one of my closest colleagues is not someone who even works for the department or works for the federal government at all. I work very closely with a policy analyst employed by a First Nations organization, a regional policy congress of First Nations, and he and I collaborate to support strategic planning, agenda building, and public health and primary care discussions, and specific projects that are focused on addressing anti-Indigenous racism, among other things. So when I actually interviewed for this job, one of the adjudicators on the panel was a First Nations partner who sits at this co-management table. And that's really epitomizes how essential our working relationships are with our First Nation partners. So it's actually one of the things that drew me the most to this job. Is I see my role and my commitment to health equity for Indigenous peoples as part of my personal responsibility as a Canadian to reconciliation. There really isn't a typical day in the life, so I won't try to make one up for me in this job. But that's exactly how I like it. And one of the things I absolutely love about policy specifically, I support program staff in 3 different directorates. I offer policy guidance on funding announcements, allocation decisions, regional presentations on trilateral responsibilities in health, and even approaches to tracking regional health priorities and impact. I'll say I worked in academia in the nonprofit sector for many years before joining the public service. And the piece of advice that people always used to give me to try to sway me away from entering the public sector was change takes too long within government. You'll grow impatient. You won't like it. You'll be out in a day. And they're not wrong. They are right. Change takes time in government. I won't deny that. But change in public institutions is laborious. And I know that a great deal of what I'm trying to influence and advise on today won't come into fruition for years. But it's also what I love about policy, because we help to make that time meaningful by ensuring thorough, well-researched, and evidence-based advice is what is provided to decision makers. So I'll say that while change takes time, deadlines are plentiful. You don't get bored in this work, and the breadth and depth of work I get to touch. I really feel like my work adds value and is meaningful in the service of Canadians, and you won't find yourself bored. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Emma. And thanks for highlighting the importance of community engagement in policy. And then you're right, sometimes small changes and little changes day by day make the biggest impact. So last but not least, we'll hear more in depth from Christopher.
Thanks so much, Sanjana. Thank you for having me. And also, I see a flurry of questions coming in, so I know we all appreciate that. So please continue to ask. So yeah, my name's Chris, Christopher Fernandez. I'm trying to think of, oh, it's always awkward sometimes when you introduce yourself, but maybe I'll just be very, very brief in that my career, similar to actually what Paul, and actually Paul and I in part work together, so it's always a familiar face. And we always say government's a bit small, so you never know who you run into at any given moment. But my career started off when I was an intern at Infrastructure Canada, which is now known as Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, I believe. But I was in my master's at Dalhousie doing my MPA, which is a public admin degree there. And in my undergraduate degree, which I did at King's University College at Western, I did some international studies. So I did international political economy, international relations, post-conflict resolution. And I sort of thought that that was the field for me. And I did some research in East Africa, and I did some research in Central Africa, and it sort of wasn't, I sort of came out not feeling the greatest, just wasn't jiving anymore with what I thought I wanted to do, and I was a bit lost. So I decided kind of on a whim to go to Dalhousie. It was in Halifax. I'd never been to Nova Scotia, so Emma, shout out to, to the East Coast there. And And I fell in love, and I fell in love with some sort of idea of I can contribute to Canadian policy. So through my internship, I eventually built my career. I started off my career there, and kind of ever since then, I've been very lucky with a lot of experiences. I've had a lot of good bosses who have brought me to different places. And so, as Paul kind of alluded to, my screen's there. Feel free to look me up on LinkedIn or connect with me. I'm not going to spend too much time on the inner and outs of each move that I've done. But I would highlight two of them. So the first one is probably my current role. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Privy Council office. And if you're not sure kind of how government works, it'd be kind of a whole talk in of itself. But I support the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister, and I currently work on Canada-US relations. So I think to Emma's kind of a little joke there about, government moving fast or the institution moving fast, I think this file is a little fast and it can be a little fast. It's certainly not boring in any case. But it's certainly one I'm very excited to be on. And then the other one is the one I also listed there, which is my time in a deputy minister's office. So as Emma alluded to previously, there's different kind of titles of roles, and in that role, I was an advisor. So I wasn't writing or generating policy, but I was sort of critiquing it and then summarizing it and finding different ways to sort of make it um, to give to our boss, who's a deputy minister. So I covered a few files at Natural Resources Canada, which is another fantastic place to work. So I don't think I have much more to say about myself. I think I want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers because I think that's super relevant. But I'm happy to answer with my colleagues and the panelists on any questions that you may have. So I'll pass it back to Sanjana and see where we go from there.
Thanks so much, Chris. Saw in the poll earlier there was a lot of interest in international work, so maybe some questions will come up there. But without further ado, welcome to the Q&A period. So in here, I will just read up the most upvoted questions, so make sure to like or comment what you want to hear the panelists talk about. So first up, we have here, so Anonymous said, it seems a wide variety of skills and competencies are needed to become a strong EC, but a lot of the EC roles may not offer opportunities to build up these skills. In today's climate of budget cuts and limited mobility, what are the most practical ways to develop missing competencies, like interpreting legislation or contributing to cabinet documents?
Start off, I think. What I would say is, in my career, what I did often is lateral. Like, another question is, how do you get where you're going? Well, competitions are important to sort of move up, but move laterally and network. That's the most important thing I'd say. If you've got a good amount of experience in one particular field, leverage that with people you know. Most departments have internal postings about opportunities because there's always quite a bit of movement. And think a little bit out of the box. If you're PM, if you're an AS, you want to do some EC work, then sort of just quick intro, demonstrate how you know something. A lot of people think everything is written, but I say as a manager, as an executive, it's so much easier to bring someone on, particularly on an assignment that you know or know of or know who they work for, so you can get their sort of review. So think of that all the people you know, you're always sort of auditioning a little bit. Your best network you have is a network that gets you places you don't even know it, and that's because someone you know and has a lot of respect for you recommends you to somebody who's looking for somebody. That's how I got a lot of my jobs. So that's how I would say, don't think about I'm only working on interprovincial affairs or whatever it might be. You sort of, what skill set do you have? Obviously horizontal collaboration, reading, writing, whatever it might be. Those are transferable to other policy areas. What do you think, Chris or Emma?
Yeah, I can just jump in quickly, especially as someone who, I felt in my first couple of jobs. My first job, I was doing like program evaluation essentially. I was, working on tables and datas and numbers, and so I felt, this kind of eagerness to try to get experience. And I think the first sort of foray was I was asked to help prepare QP, so question period response. And from that I got to know some of my legislation colleagues, and it's sort of, again, it's I think partly what it could be the area that you work in. And I think so to my answer, that's the first part. I think the other part of the question, which is, if in the situation there is, limited mobility, maybe you're not exposed. I've always been a fan of just meeting new people. So often it could be a colleague on a call that I was on, or maybe it's someone in my intranet directory, that I knew they worked in an area, and I sort of just, hey, can we grab a coffee? Can I ask you about your area and what you do? And I think a lot of times, and this is actually also to your point, Paul, sometimes competencies are not for example, maybe it's not that you have to have experience in writing an MC. Sometimes it's like, do you have experience in writing? And so you can do that in the job that you're in. Um, some of the skills you can learn along the way too. So myself, when I first joined PCO, this is my second stint. I wasn't a MC writer, but I knew how to read documents and I knew how to summarize documents and synthesize documents, and that became part of my job. So, yeah, it's a tough question, but that's maybe my 2 cents. Emma, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, that's perfect. I was just going to say a lot of it's not about the actual product, whether or not you know how to produce that, but it's about the skills that you're taking the time to enrich. So
Thanks so much for that. So the next question is, how did you get to your position and what are some errors or good mistakes that aided you to get where you are today?
I can start and just like I guess vary the order. I don't think we have like a procedure. Sorry, folks on the line, but I think we'll just kind of go for it. So a couple of things. So I mentioned earlier that I felt I mean, I think all of us will say, or in general, you put in good work and good work is recognized. I felt lucky in some regards. I had very good bosses as well, who I had really good, sort of developed good rapport with, really put my hand up, was willing to do any task because I found it fun just to try new things. And a few of my bosses have brought me along the way to my different jobs. So I was very lucky when I came to PCO the first time. It was my director/director general who brought me over here. And then it was actually my deputy minister when he got appointed deputy minister of natural resources who asked if I would join him there. And then, coming back to PCO, similar situation, I was asked to kind of join here. So I feel very lucky in that regards. But I think in also many ways, I would just highlight one quick story, which was I mentioned coffee chats. I know networking is not easy. It's not necessarily even networking. I was genuinely interested in one of my colleagues' work, got to know her very well. We developed a good rapport, kind of maintained contact for a few years. And then a few years later, she asked if I would join her office. So I think part of that is just getting to know your fellow colleagues, getting to know who's around you, where they, what they do, can sometimes just be helpful in of itself. But it also helped me realize like what I wanted to do and the areas that I really wanted to work in. Because I got to know them. I got to ask them very blunt questions about what were the good and the bad, and then it helped me tailor bits of my career. So yeah, that was sort of my path, if you will.
I
Paul,
might
Emma.
tag on to this one if I
Go
can.
ahead, Emma.
Yeah, I
Go
would just
first.
like to merge it with another question I saw around jumping from the PM to EC roles as well, which is the path that I took. And I'll just say, if you're ever given the opportunity to sit on an interview panel, if anyone ever invites you to be an adjudicator on an interview panel, take that opportunity. That was one of the greatest gifts I was given when working as a PM, because when you get that opportunity to sit and experience that process from that side, you can learn an awful lot about how you interview and how interviews are received. So if you're ever given an opportunity to participate in an evaluation process or an adjudication process, to try to take that opportunity, because there's so much you can learn about yourself and the way the process works, because it seems a lot more mysterious than it is. There really is a lot to do with formula and practice.
I just add, I think taking opportunities where they are is quite important, as Chris sort of alluded to. Competitions are definitely how a lot of promotions happen. You get in pools, but you can convince someone to bring you from a pool. And a lot of that is through being known, not necessarily about that person, but Ottawa is a very small town, and even it's kind of small. I would say a bit like what Emma just referred to. If you have your boss, your supervisor, try and go to meetings. Try to get them to bring you along so you can see how they talk about things, how they analyze things, how they negotiate with colleagues, stakeholders, etc. Sort of sitting at the right hand of smart people is a really good way to become smart yourself, I find, and to learn the processes. You can be really, really smart, and yet you get thrown into the government machine that has so many processes. And that's why moving departments in my case I think was very useful, because you realize, is this dumb because of like government, or is this dumb because of this department or this boss I'm working for? So different bosses, different styles. You can learn from working for idiots. I certainly have, but there are good people everywhere also, and you have to figure out your own level of patience about learning from a brilliant person who might not be a great manager, or vice versa, right? Really nice person, but they're not actually developing you or giving you access to sort of ways you can develop yourself. So when you're younger, I say you move around more often, be more impatient, And when you're older, you have to be, not have to be, but quite often you need to be more patient. You might have elder care, kids, whatever else is on your plate. So take advantage while you can, I think. That's what I'd say. But as far as branch out, also look at places like IPAC, like FYPN, CIC, all these organizations. Even if you're in the regions, it's harder. There's not the same level of federal jobs, perhaps, but there are organizations that help you network, and it's really good to network outside of your department because you begin to learn. Okay, this isn't just the way things are done. This is just the way things are done here, and then you can bring that experience back. And like Chris said, if you're an introvert, go out of your comfort zone, reach out to people you're interested in, and just informational interviews, figure out what they do. Just sort of broadcast yourself a little bit. And similarly, if you're an extrovert, learn like I am, shut up now and then listen more, right? And as you try and go and be passive and sort of just go to organizations and meetings and find out stuff.
If I can add, Sanjana, sorry, because there's another question in the chat that's sort of related, and I think it's um, two things actually. One thing Paul said was informational interviews. So in my master's degree, one of my courses was professional development, and we learned how to do an informational interview. So very valuable to talk. How do you talk to someone about their job? Like, how do you ask questions? How do you position your own thoughts? So maybe you are interested in working in that field, but how do you not outright say it? So I just want to stress what Paul's point there because it has helped me a lot. And then there was another question in the chat somewhere, 'cause again, I'm just kind of looking through as well. And someone said, you're using, no, sorry, I shouldn't say it that way, but it's, if, given the fiscal environment we're in, especially if there's no kind of opportunities, and there's no sort of, in a tight fiscal environment, if it's other than networking or, connections, how else, could we think? And I would say the reason why I don't answer that question directly is because when I was getting into government, it was still a bit tough. It wasn't easy in any regards. But I had a mentor who was entering government in the oh gosh, early 2010s, I think it was, when there was a program for deficit reduction action. And so he mentioned he had, I think, emailed and cold emailed about 150 people. And he had to just keep emailing and keep trying and keep persisting. So I know it's not a comfortable answer. I want to be very honest about that. But it was an answer that helped me out when I was sort of thinking like maybe these opportunities are not there for me either. So I just wanted to make sure I addressed that too.
Thanks. I really loved all those answers of going really deep into networking. That networking not just about, meeting people, but as Chris said, is about learning about meaningful work, as Paul said, about learning from brilliant people, and as Emma said, about reaching your hand up and raising your hand for unique opportunities. So the next question here is, what would be your advice for those currently in niche departments looking to expand their experience and competencies?
I'll lead off while they're thinking. I think we covered a lot of this already. If you're in a small department, obviously branch out, reach out, network, look at places within. It's harder if you're in the region, like you may just not physically see people as often. I did want to underline for policy, I think more so than other areas I've worked in, being in person is really important than in policy more than other areas. If you're writing, say, a briefing note and you are working remotely, it might goes up to your director, to your DG, and you never see it again. You don't know what changed. You might see the final version and you go, "Ooh, I'm a terrible writer because it's totally changed." Maybe that, but it could be just you didn't know some of these strategic imperatives, that you don't even have access to a higher level of information about what you can and can't say and what will attract the interest of ADMs, deputies, etc. So when you're in the room, you're more likely to be able to say, "Hey, do you mind if I make the changes and all that?" And I think that's a big difference. It's harder to develop that soft skill set as a policy analyst than something like regulatory legal frameworks or just client advice, that sort of thing that's more specific and formatted. So I think the other thing you can do for a niche, and I want to underline this, whatever you're doing now, do it well. So don't be that person that shows up and goes, "Oh, I got it here, but what I really want to do is work at, Agriculture Canada. I'm in the East Department," and be grumpy. So even minor complaints can be amplified if that's the only impact or sort of impression you have. In the past, when I've been a manager and someone wants to work for me, I ask that department. I guarantee I know people in every department. So if Chris is like asking to work here, I ask around. If they say, "Oh, Chris is like, he's here 6 months and he's talking about he needs his next job," if I need someone for 3 years on a particular program, I might say thanks, but not Chris. So keep in mind, do what you're doing well first, and then talk about your career development with your manager.
I'll just agree with that. When I was applying for my policy role, I didn't realize until afterwards that my current manager had spoken to the hiring committee and said, I know her skill set is transferable. Wasn't a request I'd made, wasn't a conversation I'd specifically had where I said I would like to be a policy analyst in First Nations health. What it was is the skills I was developing and the level of work, to Paul's point, the kind of products you're putting forward, they become known. And if you're working really hard, even if it's not a job that you necessarily want to stay in long term, that echoes.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll move on to the next question here, which says, can you share key lessons, pivotal moments of action in your early career that positively shaped your career trajectory?
A good question. If someone wants to jump in, I'm trying to think.
I'll jump in because it relates to what I said earlier. When I first got into government, it was after Program Review, late 90s. And so I was 27, I think. There was no one else under 30 because they'd all been sort of let go. There was no one over 50 because they'd all taken packages. So it was a very specific group of pretty grumpy public servants who'd been through a lot of cuts. And I started work and I was very, very keen and there wasn't a lot to do. And I tried to be a self-starter and it was pretty difficult. But I wanted to work in international fisheries and there was a director and she needed staff. I think she was supposed to have 10. She had 5. And she had 5 because she was a terrible manager and a very difficult person to work for. So I made a conscious decision to approach her and say, hey, I've got this background. I've got this master's in law. I'd like to work for you. And so that was that initiative I took. And I remember telling a friend, I can work for anyone for a year. But at the 10th month, I was having coffee with him going, oh my God. She was developing less than ideal management skills and competencies. I'll put it that way. But I learned a lot. And because she had so few people, I was doing notes that a junior analyst would normally get. I was going on trips to Madrid and other negotiations that, again, if they'd been a full team, it would have been more senior ECs. So don't always look at something and go, that's a terrible experience. And again, single, no kids, it was a different environment than now. I certainly wouldn't undertake that. But that's where you look for where do I have a comparative advantage from my experience or even my patience or energy? Okay, Chris, was that enough time?
Thanks, Paul. Saving the day there. I mentioned a couple of them, so I won't go again too into depth, but I found that when I was sort of entering and figuring out, what I wanted to do and trying to break in, I mentioned that one coffee chat I had with that one person. And I kind of attribute a lot of where I am today to that one person because, she took a chance on me, ABBA, if you love ABBA, and really just shaped my career, to where I am today. And the opportunities that I've been sort of blessed with have come from that one single coffee chat. So again, I think that's one pivotal moment. And then I mentioned as well, I know that again, I feel like this is always very thrown around, especially for like students or, they say, put your hand up for everything, but it can be good advice depending on where you are. I was, always happy to get involved, always happy to do things. And then, sort of from there, again, those bosses saw, okay, he has the capabilities to do this. Let's try to give him some more, give him to do something different. And I would say, so far, when I first came to PCO, I was on a team that supported the PM in full cabinet, so full cabinet meetings, and I got to go to a cabinet retreat and I got to, be in the room and hear how they talk and hear how cabinet sort of operates. And I think as any policy analyst, it was certainly an experience that I take with me and I'll take with me for the rest of my career. But sort of that opportunity came from that one coffee chat from 2 different departments previous. So I think in that regards, that it was such a pivotal moment. But and then I'll end off with, I've had great bosses, as I said earlier, bosses who I still stay in contact with to this day, who have become, close personal connections. We've had time outside of work as well. And I've been very lucky to have bosses who've been very, personal in their stewardship of my career. So I'm very excited to kind of quote unquote see what's next. I rejoined PCO a couple months ago on this file. And it's certainly again no easy feat, but it's certainly yeah, a great experience so far.
Thank you. Emma, did you want to also contribute too, or should I move on to the next question?
Great answers. Keep going.
Thanks so much. And actually, like hearing from both Crystal and Paul of like your experience within the government of Canada, this next question is actually the opposite, which is in your experience, it is a master's / post bachelor's degree required to break into the policy analysis. So any experience outside of the government?
I would say it's not required. There are plenty of deputy ministers that have just undergraduate degrees. Quality shines, right? Where I would say the difference, where it's helpful, is it's comparative, right? So if I'm looking at 50 CVs, you might easily go, I'm only going to look at the folks that have masters. Someone else asked about PhDs, and I knew a director of international fisheries who had a PhD in chemistry, not at all related to what his job was, but he had a PhD. What I would say is, a hiring person, anyone who's done a master's or PhD, you know they can handle a project. They've done research, they're self-starters, they've handled a lot of work independently. So that's a really core competency as far as I'm concerned. And that's really, really important. In policy, especially, there's no one going to be sitting over your shoulder saying, are you done that briefing? Like they want to know if it's done, but they're not going to necessarily tell you how to do it. They're not going to structure it. They're not going to say your research is enough. So you really have to be a self-starter and be self-motivated, I think, as opposed to other fields say, oh, I have to do 10 of these benefit claims per hour, blah, blah, blah. It's not transactional. Briefing note can take an hour or it could take 3 months, depending on the nature of it. So being a self-starter is really important. I would say master's degree helps. But again, if you meet someone, then you're in, you can shine through the ability to think through a problem, be strategic, be personable, build relationships. All those things are more important to me than any credential. But the credential might be what gets you through the door of the pile of applications in a formal process.
Yeah, I was just going to add that the stage of your career matters a little bit with that too, right? If you're early in your career, a master is going to be a significant addition to your resume to get you through that door. If you're transferring from another level of government, right? If you work for a province or you've worked in a significantly comparable role in another sector, that's going to matter as well. But certainly, if you're early stage in your career, that master's goes a long way.
The only thing I'm going to add, I think actually what Paul and Emma said was absolutely fantastic, so nothing to add there, is again, I mentioned this, but I went to Dal because I wanted to move out to the East Coast. I didn't really know what the public service was when I moved out there. I was told on day one that this could be where my job was, and I had to Google what the public service was. So, full honesty there. But a master's in some instances helps because they have, sort of, for example, built-in internships or co-ops, and that is very helpful, especially if you're trying to break into any career. For me, when I was applying for my master's, I think I applied for about 3 or 4 different programs, but all of them had internships because I didn't have a lot of job experience prior to other than schooling, so I wanted to make sure I got that, and that's where I am today. So it's again, I've had colleagues who are lawyers, I've had colleagues who are PhDs, I've had colleagues who've only had undergrad. I have a lot of colleagues. I'm sorry, actually, I have a few colleagues who transferred from other orders of government. So there is no one way, but again, I can only speak to my experience and how a master's has helped me, but it's because I had an internship in my master's.
Speaking of all this school talk, looking at the questions, there seems to be a lot of fear or more like questions about the current reality of the job market, especially during fiscal restraints. And we have 2 questions I'll read simultaneously. So one is, do you have advice for students who will be graduating next year where the job market may be difficult? And along with that, how do you manage work, life, family balance? So I kind of see it as, also mental health in there as well. So if you all have any advice kind of within this fiscal restraint.
I might hop on just to say it pulls back a little bit to the comment of a job is a job and your work is your work. Sometimes if you can get in the door and prove your skill set, it may not be what you're aiming for, but if you can find your way in, that can be a great stepping zone. It's a lot easier to move within government if you have a position than if you're trying for especially a higher level position from the outside. The other thing I'll speak to is just work-life balance. Fiscal constraint is a little bit helpful with that. I've got a toddler and I'm expecting a second, and we're not allowed to travel anywhere. We have no money in the budget for us to go anywhere. And that's a moment in my career that I really needed to not have to be traveling a lot. So there are positives and negatives depending on where you are in your career and what you're looking for. Certainly, I'm not getting to travel to other parts of the world and experience those kinds of opportunities. But if you're looking for work-life balance, sometimes fiscal restraint can help in those ways. Does mean, though, that our team is handling an awful lot more work than we have in the past. And so it's worthwhile to be aware of that, know your limits, and have an open and honest communication stream if you can with your manager about what your responsibilities are, so that you can find that balance.
I'd add to that as far essentially what Emma said and Chris alluded to, get the experience where you can. One of my directors is retiring soon, and I just learned a little while ago that his first, I think, 6 or 7 years, he was casual in term contracts before he became indeterminate in the 90s when there was huge program review is what it was called, and they let go of 50,000 public servants. So it was really, really hard for him as a scientist and then policy guy to sort of get that experience. But he's built it up over time, show your quality and network. It's not necessarily it's easy. It's, oh, they're hiring lots of people everywhere, you can fall into a job. I doubt that's what next year will look like. As far as work-life balance, I think I had a mentor and he was really useful to me early on about red lines in your career. What are the lines you're not going to cross in terms of what are you willing to put for work? Maybe 10 or 12 years ago, my first time I was acting in DG for an ADM who was calling meetings at 7 in the morning, and then she was calling meetings at 6:30. And at the time I had an infant at home. And I said to her, like, I don't mind morning meetings, or evening meetings, but I can't keep doing both because I want to be a dad. And her response at the time was, well, I thought you were serious about wanting to be a DG. And I said, well, I guess I'm not. And that was it for my acting shortly after that. So you sort of had to figure out what is more important in your life. And I don't regret it. Like for many years, I no, I want to be a director because I now have 2 little kids at home, and it's important that I can sort of manage to have personal time. And you'll find that quite often when, depending on what you're doing, newly promoted, you've got a lot to learn, a lot to do, and a lot riding on you. So you're going to want to put in longer hours. So I would say, have your own red lines and be at peace with your decisions, but sort of be firm about them.
I think both questions are excellent. I'm not going to add on to both. I appreciate. I think Paul's actually answer about the fiscal environment's a good one. So I take his words as well for even myself. On the work-life balance, I work in a very demanding environment. It includes some weekend work and et cetera. But I really appreciate. I'm just gonna reiterate what Paul said. You kind of have to know your own red lines and what that means for you and yourself. There has been times where I've had my own red lines. Family is very important to me. My parents live in the Greater Toronto area, and I'm in Ottawa, so it is a bit of a journey to get back home, to see them. But it is what it is, and that's the red line that I made myself. So I think it's an important point, and I think it was a well said point. So I just wanted to add that.
I hope the audience is able to take a lot of that wisdom from all the panelists in navigating the stress in this fiscal return. But the next question is a little bit of shift from a specific career, but more towards so Lily Chan asks, can you walk us through the process of developing new policy that you're particularly proud of? And she said, I'd love to learn more about what being a policy analyst means in practice.
It's a great question. Again, I need a second to think. I'm always like I need to take a moment to breathe and think about this one. Paul, how about you? I feel like you're a good one for this to start.
Well, my answer to that is it depends because policy means very, very different things. A memorandum cabinet, I mean, it can take a couple of months if someone really wants it to happen, or it could be the result of years of work. Okay, I've done several. Sometimes it's a priority and you do it quite quickly. The steps are generally, I mean, like you would in sort of policy analysis, you figure out what your options analysis, you do your research, you do your risks, you do your stakeholder reactions, you do your what are possible actions, costing, and that rolls up, depending on what you're doing, into a memorandum to cabinet, which goes to cabinet for decision, and then ultimately then if it's approved, it's announced in a budget, and then you have money and you go to treasury board and then you do a treasury board submission and figure out how would you actually sort of spend that money over X amount of time, etc. So the very core management of what's called the fiscal framework is you get policy cover from the Privy Council office, from cabinet, by saying, here's an action we want to take. We want to do X, say like a pharmacare plan. And you develop how will we roll that out? You might have to do FedProv negotiations, all those things. What will it cost? Then it's announced in the budget, and the Treasury Board actually manages how that program is developed, rolled out, and then there's evaluations. So that's really the big policy. And most policy analysts, if you're a policy analyst with quotation marks, you want to do that kind of work. You want to experience at Treasury Board or finance or something like that. You want to work in a policy shop for a director of policy. But there's tons of other policy. Like I worked on fisheries licensing. all these policies that control how you fish, who you fish, how they fish, what gear, what group, indigenous groups, how all those guidelines and policies, which is probably what Canadians think of when you say I work on policy, right? Lawyers work on a ton of policy and regulations. Like most legislation then is action through regulation. And those regulations might also have policy guidelines. So there's a ton of research, analysis, and writing that doesn't go the kind of cabinet route that's really important. And it affects probably more Canadians than the big cabinet stuff. I don't know if that's helpful enough, but I would just say there's all different levels of really, really big policies and small but important policies and minor ones. I'm sure that Emma has things on First Nations health where it's like how guidelines, how do we negotiate? How do we work with this community group? All those things can be sort of rules of action as opposed to something that says, how do we get money? Like an MC is actually, how do we get approval to do what we want for our minister and money?
If I can jump, I think it's a very funny story in a way, and I'll make it very succinct. I know we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that also Emma has a chance here too. But my it's not a policy at all, but it was a policy document. And I had to help write a policy document when the Queen passed away, and we had to do an accession of a new king. And I had to learn about all of these things about how do we, how do we name what's the process of naming a new king and what is their title when they become king of Canada. And I was looking at documents from the 1950s, and I think that was one of the coolest moments because I got to see a part of Canadian history, and write this document to the prime minister that said, here's what happens, and you have to go to the registrar and announce it here and do these things. And again, it's not a policy, right? Like in the pure sense of like this thing that maybe changes the lives of Canadians. I don't know. I don't want to like speak too much or I might get in trouble here about the monarchy, but it's a very interesting moment for our history. And again, I had to write a policy document on it. So what was this and what did it do and how do we change the law so that anything that was the Queen is now the king? So again, not your traditional sense, but something like I got to work on. It was my first week at PCO. So yeah, it was a cool moment in history. But again, not the traditional like policy sense, but something that was part of my job that I had to do to enable something in this country. So yeah, Emma, I'll leave you with the final word there.
Well, I don't have any stories about, naming the king, but I will say one of the interesting things I think both of you alluded to there is that there's an assumption about the term policy analyst that our job is to analyze and develop policies. And very few of us do that, especially if you're working in region. A lot of the work that we do is developing protocols, procedures, documents, terms of reference. There's a huge planning component to a lot of what we do and a massive learning component. One of the biggest pieces is that we are sponges, right? We take these ideas and we learn about them so we can digest them and then produce something that's more understandable. So that's all I wanted to add is just that there's so much to this role that's beyond the evaluation and creation of policies that leads to my point about like things take time, but it's because there's so many pieces of learning that we need to do as departments and as a government to understand that there are levels to our policy analysis and development that can be equally impactful in the lives of those you're serving.
I think being a sponge is the perfect last words, Emma, and that it definitely applies to every single career path too, I find. But with all that said, thank you, lovely panelists, for all your wisdom, and thank you, audience, for joining us today and for all your nice and difficult but also very enlightening questions. So be sure to sign up for other FYN events coming up and make sure to check out other career showcase sessions on Tuesday throughout July and August. The Federal Youth Network is hosting in-person learning days and future leaders forums across the country throughout the year. New cities have been added to their schedule, and you can find out if they're coming near you by checking out the list of cities and dates on their wiki page. Registration is free, and it's a great way to network with people in person. And one final polling question will be sent out right now as we wrap up the session, and it'll only take a moment, I promise you. And feel free to take it. And thank you everyone for joining, and best of luck with your career journey. And please feel free to connect. All of the panelists' LinkedIn have been shared in the chat, so feel free to follow them and even share your own LinkedIn as well. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjana. Good job moderating, and thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks, Sanjana. Well done.
And co-panelists. It was a pleasure
Paul.
meeting.
Thanks, Chris. Great to see you.